So it's easy to make light. I was going to make a joke about everybody who was finished getting their awards could leave, and that would leave 4 of us in the audience. But that's rude. And the other thing, it's hard not to be casual with somebody that you've worked with day in and day out over several years. But these lectures are actually very important for us as faculty, because we get to see another side of somebody that we actually don't see day to day. And so tonight, Scott's been incredible for our school. When he came 3 years ago as chair, it was at a perfect point where we were ready to shift into a new level. And I would say he was a catalyst that took us over that peak. But more than that, Scott, which probably most of you don't know, because you only know him as, a lot of times as an administrator, having started his career at Cincinnati in doing his education, down in Tulane, then teaching in Pennsylvania, and then finally to us, is also a researcher and a designer who has been at the Venice Biennale, has been at the Museum of Modern Art, is a significant presence within our design community that none of us tend to remember day to day. So tonight, it's my great pleasure, and I'm actually very excited to see another side of this work, which I'm hoping we start to see the social outreach work, the stuff in Bolivia, the things that he's doing that he believes in, committed to make a difference in our world. So social activism. So with further ado, my great pleasure to introduce Scott Scholl.
Philip. I had intended to have a bit of a prelude before a lecture. It was just going to be playing up here. And so I spent time making this thing, so I'm going to play it, even though I tell my students never, ever to do that. But I think it never meant, and it is a decent preamble to what it is I hope to talk about here today. So I'm going to back out, and off we go here. Now the musical accompaniment is lacking. But I'll stand to the side nonetheless. And as I fill in for the lack of a musical accompaniment, I think it's a perfect juxtaposition. So Philip was exactly right. I graduated from the University of Cincinnati and completely disenchanted with architecture. I had felt that at the university I had a great opportunity to study intensely a certain piece of architecture and to almost purposely ignore a lot of what I thought it meant to be an architect. And so I went and I immediately went to the exact inverse of everything I thought my faculty would want me to do, and I designed amusement parks. Because at that time, aside from Venturi and a few others, you weren't to talk about casinos and Hard Rock cafes, and to donate your talents to these things was absolutely unheard of. And I went and I worked and I had a great time. I actually found myself working with a band of misfits. All of us kind of cast out the wrong side of architecture, trying to figure out what it meant to be an architect, at least in a larger context. I then ended up going to Tulane, and while at Tulane, I studied the intersection of architecture and power concepts and try to understand how architects have been involved this is a perfect juxtaposition, in the maintenance of power, in the growth of power, in the translation of power into force, and how we might redirect that relationship to more positively impact communities that did not benefit from that conceptualization of architecture and that conceptualization of power and influence. Now, through this, I came to terms with long-standing relationships between architecture and power, as well as the dependence of the profession had developed to the institutions of power. My research unearthed the story of symbolic capital, false scarcity, and tempered influence, all of which I would be happy to discuss after this lecture. It's a fantastic juxtaposition. I should just keep this rolling for the entirety of my lecture. That one in particular. I also came to terms with the need to substantially change the project delivery system assumed by architects in order to more positively impact communities currently outside our influence, to challenge the inherently limiting linear process described by research, then design, then construction, then occupation, and to evolve, I'll pause for that because it's hilarious, and to question key terms such as site, program, client, user, as well as the manners and documents through which we explore and communicate our findings relative to said terms. Today I shall outline many of these questions. Others we can discuss after the lecture. Now the reason that you've had the privilege, and I think there's more, but yeah, there you go. All right, now I'll back out. I think I'll back out. This computer is really choking on GIFs. There you go. All right, so we talked about testing a delta. Actually, before I begin, I should mention that Brian Phillips, a fairly decorated architect in Philadelphia, and someone worth our attention, will be coming here on Thursday. And I do hope that we can show up in even greater numbers than came to see me speak. So meme tectonics. Now, for those of you who don't know, meme is a bite-sized morsel of information that is easily shared and virally propagated. The utility of this concept is well known to the advertising agent, the politician, and the Facebook aficionado. Auditory examples of a meme include "just do it," "you deserve a break today," and even the word "enjoy," whereas you say, when I say enjoy, you say Coca-Cola. Come on, people, you gotta pay attention here. This example, visual in nature, I find interesting is because it's a conglomeration of several memes, combining a commercially motivated one, the world's most interesting man who just went to Mars, and Dos Equis, and a pop culture phenomenon, mainly posed cats being snarky. Now, it's important to note that memes can be redirected, and one of the things I studied quite intently in graduate school and beyond is the counterculture meme and counterculture actors, including ad busters. And those of you interested, Kelly Lassen has a great book called Culture Jam that you might be interested to read. But in one of the, he uses situationists and their concept of détournement, and he pulls from a number of different sources to talk about how a counterculture meme might be created in such a way where you use the momentum of others, and in this case, using absolutes, commercial budget, all of the money and influence they plowed behind getting you to identify this bottle with a very particular brand of vodka, and then using that momentum by flipping it on its head to try to deliver a different message, where they didn't have to do the heavy lifting. All they could do is accept the heavy lifting done by others and redirect it. In fact, I would argue that most memes today are a redirection of the Dos Equis advertising dollar, a redirection of the resources used by Hollywood's movie machine, a redirection for an odd affinity that we as a people seem to have for cats. The fact that this redirection is often placed towards humorous or narcissistic ends is beside the point, at least for my purposes. To the other word, tectonics. Tectonics are the manner in which building components are detailed. More specifically, they, unlike simple detailing, deals with the thoughtful articulation of requisite construction, so that it not only answers pragmatic needs, but also clearly and poetically expresses construction. Studies in Tectonic Culture by Kenneth Frampton is a great book or publication to this end. Now, from this foundation emerges what I'm calling meme tectonics, bite-sized morsels of construction, information, based upon the methods of a bricoleur, the potentials found within undervalued resources, and the articulate voice of the creative professional. Now, to those dwelling within informal settlements, aspects of this concept, although generally couched using different terms, if at all, are already of some use. Without it, critical messages, where to hijack free electricity, how to find clean water, and what materials are best suited to keep the rain off your head, can be misunderstood, mistranslated, or misjudged, missteps that could greatly impact one's odds of survival. It's also present, albeit in a more prescriptive, authoritarian stance, in the field. However, for me, someone deeply engaged in socially responsive design activities, meme tectonics has offered an approach that sidesteps the limits of top-down project dissemination, which are too slow and hierarchical to be relevant within the pressure of fringe settlements, without sacrificing the knowledge base of the external expert. I believe that properly positioned meme tectonics can help us trade architecture as a creation of objects for architecture as a creation of objects of knowledge, material constructs capable of collecting the wisdom of many and propagating virally. At this point, I should note that this is counter to the processes used by many community-based designers who cultivate, often inadvertently, through community meetings, consensus building, and other fine-sounding approaches, harmful group dynamics, including information cascade, social comparison, and polarization. A point I think I made clear in my last lecture here, which I believe is still available in LTU's archives, and which was attended by like 17 times the number of people. So it's nice to see in my 4 years here, I've really the number of people interested in what I have to say. Just kidding, kind of. So rural studios, it's also counter to the approaches such as those by rural studios and other curriculum-based humanitarian initiatives that foreground a brand of tectonics that are defined through the genius of the creator, without regard to this approach's ease of adoption, expansion, or ownership. Such approaches offer creative works, including architecture intended for humanitarian purposes, that are incapable of evolution, and a population surrounding it unable to offer support. In contrast, meme tectonics creates architecture that is adoptable and expandable. By the way, this was taken 7 years after that. In contrast, meme tectonics create architecture that's adoptable and expandable, surrounded by a population equipped to evolve it and vested in its success. I shall now discuss these principles through 4 ideas. For clarity, I shall illustrate each idea through a work completed by the International Design Clinic. At this point, I should mention the International Design Clinic is a nonprofit I started in 2006, so as to provide the support structure necessary so that students and professionals might gather together and realize much needed creative work with communities in need around the world. Since 2006, the IDC has completed several dozen projects on 4 different continents, some of which I'll talk about today. The first principle I'd like to discuss is that sight is about condition. In this milieu where I practice, sight is about condition, not geography. That the physical features of the built environment are fleeting, a temporary physical manifestation of much more influential factors. To wield useful influence, architecture must be based upon a critical reframing of the physical environment, often engaging aspects that appear, at least on their surface, to be small, trivial, or inconsequential. Here, the primary determinants of engagement are about long-term potential, resilience over strength, acceleration over speed, and trajectory over place. In 2006, I began to explore these ideas, a project we now know as Street Urchin. We were invited to exhibit work recently completed in Romania, work that we based in large part on rural studios and the method that they had utilized to date in the Deep South. And in doing the work, we found that our success was limited by the fact that we still, as architects, placed ourselves at the center, whereby all knowledge must be disseminated through the genius of our hands and ideas. And instead of positioning us more peripherally or assuming a more instigatory role, which would allow more people to assume a meaningful role in the work. And because of that, the work was a beautiful object, served the purposes of the client in the way that any bona fide work of architecture likely should. But it did not have nearly the potency that we were hoping, and it did not function as virally as we had hoped. And so to address this, when the gallery asked us to exhibit the work, we said no, as politely as we could. We said instead, we would like to do a new work based upon what we learned, basically the missteps of the work we had just completed, and invest those in the community there in Chicago. And this particular gallery, and they agreed, and this gallery, the population, when you did the research, immediately around the gallery skewed towards transient. There were a lot of folks who were between homes or didn't have a home and were making ends meet on the street right there. And so we worked to try to find a way that community might have a place to rest that was warmer, safer, drier than the cardboard tenements they were using. The catch, of course, was that, well, there are a couple catches. First of all, the work had to be made completely of materials that were free and could be scavenged, because that was the budget for the project, if you wanted to assume that as a term. The second was that the entire construction process had to be disseminated without the use of professional jargon or even written language. It all had to be disseminated all graphically to the widest audience possible. So that result, what we eventually came to are these bottles, these plastic bottles and Walmart bags, and discovering a method of joining them by unscrewing the top of the bottle, compressing the bag on the exposed threads of the bottle, and then screwing the cap back on, and thus creating a joint between 2 bags that did not puncture the bag or break the integrity all of the Walmart bag. Still one of my favorite phrases. We then joined these together using the shingle-style roof so that the water would slip off it, thus be creating a hybrid if you wanted to pull from conventional architectural practice of what you would do for a membrane roof structure, which the method of attachment with the water bottle is very similar to what you'd see in a single-ply membrane roof, with a shingle-style roof, which you'd see on a steep-pitched roof. We then used rubber bands to tie the thing together and created this guy. And what's fascinating about this guy is that the air pressure within the individual water bottles is sufficient to hold the distributed weight of the occupant above the surface of the earth so that the cold of the earth didn't leach the heat of the body from the occupant. It also created a watertight structure, and because we used rubber bands to hold the whole thing together, it snapped shower cap fashion over a shopping cart or whatever else was used during the day to transmit your goods to and fro. Now, for us, the object was not the thing. As I said, our goal was to create objects of knowledge, not objects. And so to create objects of knowledge, this thing had to be something that would bring additional wisdom to it and create something better. And so for the gallery, we did not send this. Instead, we created an instruction manual. Well, first we took this out on the town and photographed it, as good architects always should. But then we created an instruction manual, a 12-step process by which this thing might be made. Now, when I say this thing, it's important to recognize for us the final form was not meaningful. As long as the basic principles of the shingle-style roof, the single membrane roof, the water tightness, all of these things were abided by, this thing could assume any number of forms or shapes. It didn't really matter. That would be based upon a program that we didn't dictate, right? So it's understanding as architects that you don't get to dictate 98% of the project. Generally, we pretend like we do, but you don't. You have to accept the fact that you get a very small influence and be strategic with that influence. We made these, and I think we have a photographic, we had a photographic version on the back side, and we sent hundreds of these manuals to the gallery where it was displayed, and then patrons to the gallery could take one of these works and make a version of it, give it away, work with someone who is interested in this kind of work to make a better version of it, critique our ideas. The center screen was just there because we knew that we would run out of manuals and then we'd have no exhibit, which would be kind of cool in a conceptual sense, but the gallery kind of hated that idea. So we had a clever video of hands putting this thing together with John Cage music. It was very artsy. But it was good because the manuals went away after about 2 days. And it was only the visual. A similar process was used when we were invited by Mural Arts of Philadelphia to look at a schoolyard there in the city, a schoolyard which had seen a fair share of abuse, causing the school to make this ironic move of putting a big fence around a public schoolyard to keep the public off the public schoolyard, right? And that tension of the fence and what it meant served as the driving force behind the project. And so as you can see, we used the fence as the chief structural system and played with how you could use simple 90-degree angles, but change the plane of rotation so as to create more possibilities in terms of programmed use, greater structural efficiency, et cetera. And some of these experiments went somewhere, some didn't, such as I was fascinated with those really horrible plastic things that are used you strip through fences to create privacy, but they have a really interesting kind of bend to them that's quite finicky. If you go a little far, they'll crease on you. And it's trying to understand how to play with them so that they can become the most beautiful or appropriate version of themselves, right? The fence did this, so what was interesting is the contorted structure that created, and this was all indicated by the bar stock itself and how it wanted to function, caused the fence to deform in a compound curvature, which of course led to a greater strength of the fence too, right? And then coming alongside that, using these ribbons to kind of accentuate it. Anyways, we ended up going with this. And what was interesting is that fence was really the only purchased product, the fence and the screws. Everything else was donated by the community. And when I mean community, I mean that in a really encompassing manner. And I think the reason is because we as a people, we tend to gift. That's something we do. And so if you go to dinner, you'll bring a bottle of wine or chocolate, right? Or cheese or whatever else you can try to bring. If you go to a funeral, if you go to a birthday, if you come to my lecture, you should bring wine. All of these things, right, are what we do as a people. And so when we started this project, the community came and they all had like chunks of wood in their garage. And there was a guy ripping up sidewalks down the street that didn't want to pay the city $50 to landfill the stuff, which was the cost. So we said, well, just bring it to us for $0, and We'll figure out what to do with it. And that became the ballast for the bench, as well as a way of creating these raised garden spaces. Part of that response was based on trying to stop the stormwater runoff, which is a huge problem in Philly as it is here, because they have a combined sewer system. And so during rain events, oftentimes that combined sewer has more water than it could deal with, resulting in effluent flowing into the rivers. And so finding ways where small sites like this can just slow down the passage of water, and if it can grow indigenous plants, some weeds, we might call them weeds or whatnot, but they're plants that are not invasive, they are actually of that place. That's how we position this. There's a red, you see a little bit of red there, that's a church door. A church down the street donated their old door to the project. And so there's this really beautiful coming together in the kind of sense, the same sense that you see quilts. You know, quilts were they were put forward by, again, by poverty, the fact that folks couldn't afford giant swaths of cloth, and so, but they had remnants, and you could stitch the remnants together to make something larger, and so it's aesthetic based of scarcity. And so was this, and it seemed appropriate. Now this thing is covered with greeny growies and is an elaborate canopy. And once again, a manual following how you would build this, how you would construct it, what the principles were behind the module. And what was interesting, the module could range considerably in height. If you go back, you see it going nearly to flat down there and then vaulting up here. It's the same structural system. It's just kind of changing that plane of rotation subtly. The second thing I've come to believe in this work is that small is okay, that size is earned, not bestowed, that practice disturbs. I believe that fundamentally that is the case. To articulate this disruption well, the designer must allow the size and complexity of the work to be proportionate with his or her understanding of the impacted environment, especially as related to the site's more resilient underlying factors, read factors that are hard to figure out. As these conditions are quite difficult to discern and impossible to uncover, the architect must generally start quite small with works that earn their influence not through size, cost, or opulence, or prestige, but through their articulate engagement with more powerful actors. When we were asked to go to India, we were working with a group that operated schools on the construction sites there, schools that would be in use for about 2 years and then be bulldozed. And the reason is because what would happen is that the kids of the folks who were building the condos and the other things, they would move with their parents onto the site and live directly on the construction sites. And their parents would work and they would do what they do, as kids do, and sometimes pose risk to themselves and to others. And so this group would go to the construction sites and say, we would happily provide a school if you give us space and a building. So they'll provide the infrastructure of school, which will help the kids stay off the construction sites, and mom and dad won't be distracted so they can concentrate fully on the construction. They're, again, talking to developers. Developers thought this a good idea, and so would provide a building. And this whole project eventually placed me in an odd position as an architect of creating non-architecture, or translating things that had been architecture into things that were not architecture. And the reason is because every act of architecture, meaning solid, traditionally defined as kind of concrete blocks and giant roofs and all of the big things that we know and love, those we demolished after 2 years and leave behind quite a bit of rubble and have a bunch of expense up front that didn't really do much. And so our question was, how do you take those aspects of school and translate them to something that could fit on the back of an auto rickshaw, or make furniture that was smarter so that the building itself and the stuff that would be wasted could be less invasive, less intense. All right? So take pressure off architecture with stuff can travel from site to site to site to site. So I became an advocate for like industrial design, right, and transportation design and things like that. Here you can see one of the work in the corner, just to explain a few of these. This is a $2 water filter. It's made with those bags that you stick sweaters in and hook a vacuum up so you suck the air out. The plastic used in those bags is better than the water bottles that I have right next to me in terms of leaching chemicals into the water. And then taking a silver-sided tarp, which can be laid out on the site, and the sun could heat the water and remove a certain level of the contaminants from the water. Again, not all of the contaminants, but what we were addressing in this instance is they had enough gas, they could afford enough gas to create potable water for drinking, but not to wash cups and such. And so how do you create something that's somewhere between 0% clean and 100% potable, right? In the hopes of continuing to build. One of the things I've grown to believe is that Problem solving is a really poor goal for architects and designers as a whole, as I think if we're really engaging the critical issues that confront us, we have to admit that there's a complexity there that we can't solve. They're not solvable. We can engage them, we can move them forward, we can have productive conversations around them, and then hopefully our work will grow, and it won't be our work, it'll be work that's much more broadly defined so that even smarter people can come in contact with these situations, and then over time, something that looks like a solution might happen. I've come to believe that, you know, if you're an industrial designer, if you're an architect, or you're a graphic designer, and you seek out to problem solve, you're going to inherently limit the things you engage in your ambition to solve it, because we can't solve those really complex, tricky things. So within the, this project, you see a couple other pieces. I'm not going to go into detail. There's a portable earth wall in the corner that uses the reinforcing bar that was present on the site, lined with the tarps that were also present on the site, so that you could fill that with earth from the site, and then after 2 years, rather than leave behind chips of broken concrete block, you could return the earth to the site from which you pulled it. We also included within that a way that plants indigenous to place and also able to clean the earth could be incorporated, so that the earth you bring back could actually be cleaner than the earth you put in. And then of course, once again, figuring out how you communicate this effectively without the use of words or proprietary shorthand. And when we came back, we were asked to exhibit the work. And one of the things I was quite horrified by is the idea of exhibiting this work from India and going into a gallery space and having folks from a very different walk of life sip expensive wine and look at those poor people of India. I was very, very cautious of that, and I think that there are many pieces of the gallery I'm quite skeptical of, and I think there are dangers there. So trying to figure out how we could communicate this work and eventually resolving around a $2 projector that uses cannibalized postal service boxes, which I think is strictly legal, I think. There are 2 boxes, and you see what the box itself is. Here's one. Right. The outside box, they're all flat rate shipping boxes, which the post office will give to any LLC for free. So I had an LLC, so they gave it to us for free. You take one, you rip it apart, it furnishes the guts of the thing, which allows you to create a projector with a useful focal length of between 2 and 10 feet, I think we found. And then we built one of these projectors for every image taken while we were abroad, whether that image was taken by one of us, one of the children in the creche, one of the teachers of the creche, we didn't care. And we installed those, I think there were 300 and some odd, and we installed in the space of the gallery, and then allowed patrons to the gallery to adjust, to turn them on, to turn them off, to make the images larger or smaller, so that they, in some respects, were responsible for the discussion that was happening in the gallery space. The most important thing we did, though, is we invited patrons to the gallery to steal boxes. And to send them to locations that they believed more fitting for this conversation. It was our belief that the gallery is probably the least fitting, or one of the least fitting contexts for the conversation. You can see this is one of the eventual homes, right? Someone placing it within one of those street signs, boxes which aren't used for most of the week, and then just putting a piece of Mylar in the front to catch the image. These things are still bouncing around parts of the US and Canada, which is exciting. It's 4 years later, I think. And this really got sticky because now, and we talked about tectonic being more than detailing. For this, the construction of the box itself was actually relatively simple, and we could communicate that in very few steps. What was trickier is how you communicate the conceptual thinking that went into the placement of the box, right? How do you communicate in some respects the design process for someone that's taking this box and, okay, I've gotten this, I've received this thing. How do I place it appropriately? What does appropriate look like? I've also come to believe that program is not fixed, despite the words we place on it that appear to be fixed and appear to be resolved, words like kitchen and auditoria and things like that, but emerges as new users reimagine, re-inhabit, or reconstruct. And that instead of demanding a particular user and defining right and proper behavior, I believe architecture, at least where I operate, must root itself in the context of existing uses and gradually instigate a clarification of these activities, a more responsive architecture. An example of that could be found in Fence Pocket, the last things I created before coming here. It actually, Fence Pocket is how you would say it. It is based on Hot Pocket. It's also based on the fact that fences are really peculiar animals because they're hung, right? And they're very strong in one direction and very weak in the other, which causes a deformation, a predictable deformation along one line, right, when you're going through the city streets. And if you believe that fences define the perceptual edge between public and private, right, stay off my land, that's kind of what fences do, and the sidewalk space being made to be public, then when the fence bends like that, it starts to create a thickening of that line, right? And suddenly the line becomes something that's occupiable. And so how can we take reclaimed tarp and stitch it together in such a way where we allow there to be different occupations for that thickening of the line? So these things were tailored to the deformations of the fence. We would drop plumb bobs down and mark the fence to determine exactly where it deviated from the sidewalk so that we didn't intrude on the sidewalk space. Now these intrude on the sidewalk space, but what's important to recognize is we didn't program these. We placed the architectural armature there, and then the community did. And so in this community, they had a lot of tension with the landowner here because the community really wanted a park. They had been looking at his weed-strewn lot for a long, long time and were quite fed up. And so when we installed this here, they installed shrubbery. That was their idea. Other communities used them as trash bins because the city didn't provide trash bins. And it's interesting for me to stand here and think of the architecture we're working to produce, the noblest and best use being a trash can and being quite proud of it, but I am quite proud of that. Because it's an architecture that didn't demand that, oh no, take that trash out, you're supposed to sit in this, or you're supposed to stick a plant in it. It was the residents of this place understood that area better than I probably could ever understand it. And that's one of the things I try to communicate to students and young professionals that I take with me abroad, is your idea is not to try to approximate the understanding of the supposed insider. And that whole idea of insider and outsider is a bit spurious, right? It's more a dimmer switch than an off-on thing. As an example, when we went to India, we were really keen to develop work in Dharavi. And we wanted, not to develop work, but to look at the businesses that were already happening there, because the gross domestic product, if you considered that a place, an entity, a country, is outstanding in that space. And so we were trying to talk to the members of the community there and to bring the work into that was already happening and use that as the driving force to our response, right? And the resistance of the students in India and the people of the school was astounding. And it was very interesting, too, when you saw members of our team that were coming from the US who had spent quality time in North Philly and in some pretty rough neighborhoods, having less reluctance to engage folk of a different socioeconomic class. Actually having an ability in some respects to communicate with members of a different socioeconomic class more effectively than people who are supposedly of the same nation, right? And so in that case, who is the insider and who is the outsider? And then you go into Dharavi, and is someone an insider if they've been there for a year, 10 years, 20 years? Where do you draw that line? That's what I mean. It's a bit tricky, and it doesn't really make much sense. And so trying to find a way that you just become a responsible version of whatever it is you are. And if you're an outsider to the situation, most of us are, then be a responsible one. In the fence pocket, here, how you look at me. That was doing it between the hours of 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. Again, less questions asked during installation. You always want to keep the people installing your work out of jail. That was one of the things that we were after. The final thing I'd like to discuss is architecture for destruction, a little homage to Guns N' Roses. That the chief aspiration of architecture can sometimes be the facilitation of its own destruction and potential reconstruction. Architecture where I operate is not a precious object coffered behind physical or theoretical bulwarks. Architecture here is offered provisionally to be pushed against, stretched, deformed, and adjusted. In its finest moments, architecture of this place will function as an object of knowledge, revealing the long-term potency of these mass concerns. And at times, this will be through its embrace, at times through its commandeering, and at times through its destruction. It's not validated by popular consensus, and whether it's hijacked, embraced, or destroyed, the chief accomplishment is always the investigation of condition over the proclamation of self. And this is where I'm going to spend, this is the last project I'll cover today, I'm going to spend a little time on it. Many people in this room know that I've spent the last several years in Bolivia working with various communities. And when I say I don't mean I as me. I mean I as a part of the IDC and these teams, and I think all told there are probably several hundred people that have been involved in this work. And the work started very slowly, with just trying to understand and help others understand what was happening in that space. The space not being a physical space, the space being the space of a conversation started by an arts organization who'd been operating on the streets of La Paz for a long time, trying to figure out how kids who had dropped out of school around 3rd grade, 5th grade, or forced out of school at that time by their families so that they could help make ends meet through shining shoes or crime or prostitution or any other nature of things, how they could introduce arts-based education and education in general within that community. It was a community that was living, hand to mouth. So it was a community that couldn't afford the luxury that everyone in this room knows, right? The luxury of, hey, let's pause life for 4 years and just study something for a time. Or a luxury that I knew, and many people in this room knew in high school, where you could say, all right, well, I'm gonna hop in a car now, and I'm gonna travel, 15 minutes, and I'm gonna spend 7 hours in a place and learn all these things, and then I'm gonna hop in the car back. They just simply didn't have that 7.5 hours at their disposal without it affecting their ability to eat, right? And so how do you break down school and educational opportunities into smaller nuggets? How do you break it down so that you don't have to traffic across the city? And their commute would be much longer. In La Paz, it would be about a half hour, 45 minutes. So an hour added on to the 7-hour school day. They simply couldn't do it. So how do you make it so that it can happen street corner to street corner? How do you make it so that it can happen in 5-minute increments? And so to understand this, we first had to understand the community. And it was a community of folks who made ends meet largely through vending. And so you can see here, us trying to understand how in this illegal market, they said, we're open for business, or we're closed for the day, or we're closed for lunch, we'll be back in 15 minutes. And it wasn't through signage that these messages were communicated, but through the subtle folding of these blue tarps. And the bungee, and the way those blue tarps were bungeed or not bungeed to the merchandise would say, hey, we'll be back in a half hour, right? Or we're closed for the day. Looking very carefully, this is a shoe shine box taken by the Lustrabota or shoe shine boys. Many of the shoe shine boys lived in the El Alto, which was the supposedly fringe settlement. It had 1.2 million people in it, so how fringe can you be at that point? On the city's edge, and the city of 800,000, the city proper of La Paz. They would live in El Alto, and they would traffic down to the city to shine shoes for the week, and then they'd hightail it back up. All their belongings for their profession fit in this box. All their belongings for their person fit in a backpack. That's kind of how it operated. And so as architects trying to understand, and designers try to understand how we could be a part of that environment. And this card you'll see in a moment was a work that we put into the kind of circulation system of that space. We ended up photo documenting several hundred shoe shine boxes, just how the works were, how everything was stacked in there, how they made choices of what was in and what was out. As we operate and do these things, it's important we don't take advantage of the time. We volunteer, but when we work with Lustrabota, we pay them, and we always pay the folks with whom we work. So if there are several Lustrabota that we worked with for several days, we paid them, we've doubled their daily wage was what we had worked out. And it's really fascinating. That's a whole conversation that we can have is what is a fair wage to pay? Do you pay what you yourself would be paid, even though that would be completely exorbitant to that place? Do you pay the daily wage exactly? What do you pay? And that was we've reached a different conclusion, actually, every country we've gone to. But in La Paz, through consultation with others who were a little smarter on this front, we agreed on kind of double the daily wage. These were some initial installations trying to understand the space. I think many of these were put forward as a part of a challenge or an assignment I gave to the team called $5 of Good, where I gave the members of the team 48 hours and $5 and $5 was the daily wage of a Lustrabota, to engage a condition or a situation that we had unearthed through our research and to impact it positively. And so you see different responses up here to street events, art events. The one that's colored up there is made by Sam Kelly, who's now a photographer in Philadelphia. She was studying photography, a master's level at MFA in photography at that time. She herself had been born in La Paz, and a month after birth was given to a convent. Her parents couldn't afford to keep her. And so she was given, and the convents there have these metal doors that look like revolving doors where babies are placed, and you turn them, and then there's always a nun on duty on the other side. Because in La Paz, they had a big problem with people just abandoning kids. They would find them in all sorts of horrible spaces where they would, of course, have been dead. And so the convents started to create these little doors that allowed people to give their children up. And she was given up in that way. And she was adopted eventually by two people from the US, brought her back to the US. And she carried with her two Polaroid photographs. One was of a nun holding her in a bedroom, and you could see a lamp and a bed. And the other was in a kitchen where she was playing. She took those two photographs and located the convent and found the nuns and thanked them, which is kind of powerful. I mean, really powerful attachment to her past. She then took the $5 I gave her for this project and her skills as a photographer and set up a free photo booth within communities where they didn't have access to cameras. And I know this sounds obscene with all the cell phones we all have in our pockets, but there are communities that don't have this, right, or the ability to develop them. So she set that up, and then she said, meet me back here. To everyone that she took their picture, she said, come back here at 4 o'clock and I'll have your photograph. And she used the $5 to pay for developing and film. That was what she paid for. She ended up developing 2 copies of that, doubles, and her entire muse for the rest of it is how she would behave responsibly with the photograph she kept. Because she gave one, of course, to the person, but then she kept the other. And where do you exhibit that? How do you share the life of this kid or these people that you've taken a photograph with? The other one I wanted to talk about is this was Michael Pope. He's currently an educator in Vermont. And he spoke not a lick of Spanish and had no skill whatsoever in music. But what he did, nevertheless, is he spent his $5 on a blue tarp and musical instruments, really cheap musical instruments, and sat down and started to play these instruments clumsily, badly. And kids would come and play these musical instruments with him to show him how it's done. And I have this photograph. This guy is a lustrabota, and usually lustra cover their faces. They have ski masks that they wear even though it's really hot outside because they'll be made fun of in school. What they do is not looked upon well. It's not a profession of pride. And so they hide their identity. They also wear gloves to keep the shine off their hands because that's another indicator that they're trying to do away with. And so that lustrabota revealing his identity was kind of a huge deal, especially when it was in the context of a gringo not playing music well, playing it poorly. We then tried to figure out in the city of 800,000 where, in this kind of large scale, where did vending activities occur, legal, illegal? And so I was fortunate to receive several grants and was able to hire lustrabota and folks from the nonprofits with whom we were working. And by this time, there were probably 3 or 4. What was interesting in Bolivia, we started with one key nonprofit partner, and then, and we didn't engage, it wasn't the traditional kind of client thing. They invited us in to engage the situation that they themselves had been dancing with for some time, and so we did. But we weren't answerable to them to provide a school or provide a widget that they needed. That was within our jurisdiction. But what we did produce, we installed these small pieces, and other people that were also interested in this situation came to the work and came to us. And so by the time we left, we were working with 6 different nonprofits, all of whom came to us through the work. So the architecture in a certain way recruiting. This is us mapping out every instance of market, formal, informal, at different scales, when it's open and when it's closed, where it happens. And so this led to our map of the new school of sorts, like where we would deploy a school that would go street corner to street corner or along the streets, trying to understand where the kids already were. And then starting with educational devices that cost less than a penny. So this is using postcards to try to teach framing, and we would teach how the eye worked and all sorts of fundamentals, it was like basic design, right, for kids who are on the street, but in a postcard. So we would use optical illusions, we would use challenges, we would use games, the goal being to make these cards something that they would want to keep, so we tried to create some artistry and some beauty to them. That's why when we saw one of these cards in the lustrabota box weeks later, we were like, wow, that's meaningful, that's something, right? And then at times the card would indicate that, okay, this is something we need to talk about a little bit more because the kids would tell us this through their interest. And so framing, you could see a small cardboard device, that was the next scale. So when we were smart enough, and this is again allowing the architecture to fit the conviction of the designer in our understanding. So initially we had about less than a penny of understanding. We just did it like 1,000 times. And then we threw that into the world and charted which of these cards worked, which didn't, which population groups grabbed them, which ones could care less, and then used that to do the next generation, which cost, I think, $2. And used cardboard, which we treated with wax, and then used Gorilla Tape, as you can see on the outside, to prevent it from decaying early because of the corrugations and not letting water come in there. And then over time, you know, those became larger and larger and larger. Looking very carefully at when we deployed these boxes, and eventually we had boxes about this size that we would do street corner to street corner, noting things like 90-some-odd% of the kids who would come up would ignore every instrument but the drums, because they just wanted to beat on the drums, right? And to the point that they would break the drums, we'd have to replace them every few days. And so the drums became that driver and gradually grew. The same thing's true with talking about photography and the operation of the eye. And eventually those questions about how the eye operates and the bias of the eye led to a very pronounced photography kind of emphasis within this work. And photography is useful because for this to have any legs, it had to have a way to make income attached to it. Again, we're not dealing with the luxury of, okay, I'm gonna have someone support me while I study something. These kids had to have a way of making ends meet as they were studying it and to push the art forward. And so photography was useful, which I'll show in a moment, because it did have that revenue stream. Even the box itself, so this is an example of one of the boxes. The box functioned as a pinhole camera, right? And so to show the people that you could see La Paz inside that box, this guy was freaked out by it, right? Because you could see the city inside there through the pinhole camera. And explain that's very similar to actually how the eye operates, how the camera operates, and then that leading the way to other conversations. These are a little bit larger works. This is a new partner came in. They did a lot of work with performance art, and they were working in El Alto where there's not a real park system per se, again, because you're not dealing with a community that has mayors or government or taxes or cops or these sorts of things, so there's not really a park. And so they said, is there a way that we can have a deployable Parkscape, something that could go street corner to street corner? And that led to a very long, kind of a 2-year design process. You can see a few pieces here. I think I have a better shot of it in a second. This is that drum thing growing. And these are sketches, and I want to make that clear that often, you know, when we talk about sketches in the design fields, we whip out a sketchbook, right? The name would indicate that's true. Most of our sketches occurred on the street, so that the PVC vendor who thought we were crazy was right next to us. And we sat there, we dry fit this PVC, and when we had conviction that this is the right size of PVC, then we'd purchase it. So we're like, okay, we'll take 2 of those because we're about to cut it up and drill it, and you can't have it back, right? And then we'd experiment with it. And then once we figured it out, then we'd make the big purchase. So it was drum kit, and then putting it on the street to see whether it works or whether, you know, our earlier readings through a more modest architecture actually made sense or accurate. Eventually earning the right to go from PVC to metal, welding, and installing. And so this is in the market. You can see here, it's rolled up. The markets were actually pretty close together, so you could roll this from market to market. And what's interesting about this is that when the architecture existed about this scale, you had to have a person next to it, right? You had to have a teacher. Now, they had a lot of volunteers, so that wasn't necessarily a problem. But as the architecture grew to this scale, the teacher didn't need to be there, right? And so there's this kind of trade that our nonprofit partner could make, that do you want to pay for, you want to dedicate a volunteer here, which had a certain cost, not financial, but a cost with it? Or do you spend more money to the architecture so that you take the pressure? So one teacher could facilitate 5 of these installations, right? Bouncing around and then leaving. Because the thing itself kind of set up a game, you know, and the kids would invent games. And what was also interesting about this is this little guy, you know, would beat on the drums for a bit, and then he'd hand the sticks to his friend to say, try beat me, right? Do better, because I just did that. Do you hear that? I'm pretty bad. And then he would beat on it for a bit and hand the sticks back. And what was interesting about that, for me at least as an educator, is that the group with whom we were working, or with which we were working, they were really keen on free expression. That's all they were about. Just get the kids to beat on a drum for a little bit, get them to write a bit, get them to color a little bit, anything. But through the challenge and the games invented by the kids themselves, they developed a more rigorous frame around those activities. And the beginnings of what I would argue would be lesson plans and maybe even over time a curriculum, right? or even learning objectives that could be built into these games. Now, I'm showing works that have grown. It's important to know that sometimes works didn't and they shouldn't. I mean, actually, the incidence of work that failed to grow is much higher than the incidence that grew. And it's not because the work is good or bad. It's because it wasn't attached to those conditions that would be required to sustain it. So this, as you can see in the corner there, it's Digilama on the side there. We were fascinated by the community. There was this kind of mythology that, because at one time it was true, it's no longer true, but if you didn't finish your house, meaning you didn't paint it, left it in clay block like that, you paid less taxes. And so no one finished it. And it led to this really beautiful pixelation of the hillside all around. All the houses were kind of like this. But the people viewed it with shame, right? Because to them, it was cheapness. It was dodging taxes. It wasn't a thing of beauty in its own right. They also had these buses here. And a lot of the community yearned for buses that were like our buses, giant buses that smelled like French fries and had Wi-Fi and things like that. And what this was, these are buses that were run by just, some dude that had scraped together enough money to buy a bus. He then joined a group, all of whom painted their buses a certain color and went to a certain cardinal axis. So blues went north-south, oranges went east-west, northeast, southeast had a color. And that's basically how it ran, and you paid a membership fee or you were a member of it. And there's something really quite wonderful about that. But again, if you're of that place, you don't view that strangely, and you almost understand too much about it to view it with any wonder, right? It's common. At the same time, there was great pride embedded in things like llamas, but you couldn't find a llama. You only found llamas on hats and in sweaters. You couldn't find an actual llama in the city, right? And there was also this reverence for the cardinal axes, but not as attached to buses, just as a thing for sun setting and rising and all of that. So Digilama were these installs, and we did trying to combine these, where you installed on the grid of these buildings with their pixelation colors that pointed to the cardinal axes based on the bus colors, right? Using a lot of abandoned housing stock that had been graffitied over by, largely the graffiti of this place was either incomprehensible or was dedicated to sell you Coca-Cola or sell you a politician. Those are kind of the three things. And so trying to find a different way in this space for graffiti. This is a graphic design student who came with us. She worked with a group that made these beautiful puzzles. You can see them down there. They had this carpenter, probably been at it for several decades. He was like 70 some odd years old. And he would produce these just beautiful puzzles. And he'd pump a couple out a day. But unfortunately, when they sold it to the folks there in the community, the folks in the community couldn't afford puzzles that would actually pay him what he earned. So their idea to raise money actually was losing them money because they couldn't charge enough to the community to offset the costs of this guy and the materials. And so this branding campaign was so that they could begin to sell it to tourists and then eventually even begin to sell it online or through mailing so that they could start to gouge Americans for this stuff, or Brazilians who could pay a lot more money. This is Leslie's work, environmental graphic design student. She had several projects, and actually before we left was hired by this 5-star restaurant with whom we were working, and they brought her in to do all sorts of things. I'm featuring one of my favorite projects, which was using the waste packaging as ingredients to paper and trying to understand how, and also rinds of different vegetables to create paper that actually had a little bit of a smell to it, and using that as for menus and for other promotional materials. It also became this really beautiful register of the kind of the waste, as there isn't recycling in Bolivia, and so that's just kind of, you don't talk about it. So it was a way of taking it, so when the menu turned brown, you know that they had imported wine to the restaurant like last week. Because otherwise it would be more to gray because it was all about the eggs. Because that's what really drove the conversation, at least in terms of packaging. It was the gray of egg crates. This is a little garden we did on the back for them. That's Leslie's mural. It's like 2 stories tall. It's truly heroic. Vertical garden so that they could teach. They brought in people that had an interest in the culinary arts from El Alto. And through a series of educational experiences, eventually leading to a residency in this 5-star restaurant, they taught them the culinary arts, highlighting indigenous methods of making and indigenous foodstuffs. It's funded by Klaus Meyer, who owns a fairly famous, well-known restaurant in Europe. This is that aforementioned photography piece. Eventually, it resulted in kids taking photographs of their version of Bolivia and La Paz, which the IDC then funded a series of postcards to sell to tourists. And the money from those postcards they went three ways. There was enough to buy 2 postcards for every one sold, and the rest of the profit, half of it went to a foundation, which helped Lustrobota, and gave them meals, showers, things like that. And then the other half went to the artist himself, mostly him, sometimes her, but mostly himself. So that's still bouncing around a little bit. In the context of making the parks I mentioned before, originally we had hired a guy named Martin to weld these parks and working with this theater troupe. And Martin liked to drink. And so we would show up at like 8 a.m. ready to work, right? Because we are just the eager beavers that we are. And Martin wouldn't roll in until like 1. And we had like 5 days and we had to head out back, we were gone. And so eventually Martin's son, who owned the welding shop just around the corner in La Alto, down the way a bit, took pity on the weird gringos standing around looking lost and opened up Martin's shop. And so that's when we came in there and we started to weld and cut and make the thing. So basically we paid Martin an exorbitant fee to use his tools and not show up. So when we went back, we said, well, let's pay that exorbitant fee, but let's use it to work with this theater troupe who was quite eager to develop vocational opportunities and educational opportunities around woodworking, metalworking, et cetera, fabric working, because they were a theater troupe, and so they made stages and costumes and all that great stuff. And so that eventually led to this space where these different components, these guys would be packed in a truck where they would teach it in small villages around El Alto and La Paz. The cart there would be rolled out to the street, so the street becomes a street corner or a classroom space of sorts. And also that garage became a classroom. Now, this is, I know this is really simple work. I know it's in some respects very humble, but I want to make a point here, is this is a group that had not many Boliviano to scrape together. Right? They didn't have a lot of money, they didn't have a lot of space. Every space they had was used for like 16 different purposes, because that's all they had. And over the 2 years, through the conversation and this work, they were so invested in this work that they gave the entire first floor garage to this makerspace, which was it's a huge deal. And it's just as huge as the Lustrobota saying that postcard deserves space in my box. All right, those are big investments. And you just have to, and one of the struggles I have often when someone will come with is to understand that is a huge investment and a vote of confidence and something that shows the work reaching grounding. This is still in use. They're still teaching classes out of the space. And this was a project that there was no client for the project. The project emerged and a client moved towards it or maybe adopted it. So it's architecture that was adopted and earned its place and its space. These are the way that we made a park that could be transported using the vending architectures of that place. So those little blue scales would fold down, and that was based on asking kids to draw a park and finding them all coloring it green, because in this community, green meant soccer field and soccer field meant play. And really, the soccer fields were the only things green in this community, right? So finding a way that AstroTurf could resonate as a play or an indicator of play. Those wings were deployable trees, because you can't put a tree on a cart. Well, you can, but you're going to be hauling roots around, and roots are heavy. So how do you make what the tree is? And it was interesting, when the kids drew their parks, they all drew slides, even though none of them actually played on the slide. They all drew trees because that's where mom and dad hung out, but they didn't really use the trees. They would use the ground around, they would like invent goals and play soccer, they would do those things, but they needed these other pieces for play to occur. So there's the ubiquitous slide, which was made so that it would be more fun to climb up in the way that they'd always been climbing up it than sliding down, which they actually didn't care about anyways. And then underneath it would be stored all sorts of other things for play, and the whole thing would be deployed the costumes, every piece of this were park as well. So signage or shade structures or whatnot, and then deploying it. And it really didn't make sense until it was deployed, right? And this is, it had a gravitational pull to it, not just in terms of other people wanting to work with us or to have versions of this, but the kids themselves coming to the work without invitation, just like the little vending school. It made sense. I'm struggling right now to figure out how this stuff reaches here, and working with Jim Stevens and Ayode and Brian Otragi and a lot of students in this room, trying to figure out how meme tectonics, how you can use this, this approach, or how this approach might be related to the production of affordable housing here in our community, with the intent of building an affordable home here in the summer. So thank you. We got a few minutes for questions. We have 11 minutes before the TSD banquet for questions.
I think you know how to find them.
Is this like the Olin Dotson moment where, like, you know, we had no one asking questions until someone asked a question and then we had a slew of them?
Yeah, that's...
Anyone here see Olin's lecture? Yeah? If you haven't, you know, you missed, you should absolutely look it up. I think this is, in some respects, a nice follow-up to his lecture. Unintentionally, but.
There we go.
Two of them, yes.
What's ongoing and what's next for you from here?
So I really think that there's a lot to be learned from the work already installed in Bolivia, and trying to understand that work and analyzing what we did over the course of 4 years to see whether that needed that length of time or if there's ways to bring that down to a smaller timeline. We've been invited by 3 different groups in South Africa to be a part of work that they're doing there, and mainly because I presented this work at the university, Stellenbosch University, and so you got to come here. So I think that's probably next on the docket. I'm really keen to understand how design build, which is not aligned directly with this work, but there is something there. And so this work that we're doing with Habitat, I'm curious about how that speaks to this as a process, or how those two things relate. And so this work this summer, I'm excited to see it hit the ground and see what comes from that. So those are the next few pieces. Yeah, thanks.
Traditionally in architecture, we don't do so well with post-occupancy studies. You know, what happens after we launch whatever it is into the world. So I'm curious, given the kind of work that you do, and it's really interesting work, what is success? How do you measure? How do you calibrate in order to help you move forward?
It's a really good question, because the minute you say that destruction is a measure of success in some regards, because you can learn from it, right? So I'll tell you, in Bolivia, what we found to be successful were those moments where the work collected resources that helped to address the situation that we were asked to address. So if we were asked to address how one brings education street corner to street corner to a population completely not served by schools currently, that the IDC raises money and we raise corporate and personal, we get corporate and personal donations to kind of fund these projects. We don't ask for dime one from any of our nonprofit partners, and we pay for scholarships for the students to help them go. So when those investments lead to investments of others, so the fact that Teatro Trono gave us that garage space, or gave the work, not us, gave the work the garage space, that's a moment of success, I think. The fact that that continues to grow, that they continue to put those bins in their pickup truck and take them to villages to teach woodworking, that's a success. That's a moment of success. And the trickier part for me, so I love this question. So there's success, and then there's when does it become enough that you as a designer, as an architect, as an artist, need to step out and just let it go? And that, I had intended to go to Bolivia for like 2 years, and then new partners came in and new works came, and oh, I have to go back and see this, or if this could just have this little bit more support, I know it could, you know, move forward. And I'm really now committed to stepping away and seeing which of these things evolve and which of these things atrophy and die. And so I'm still performing post-occupancy evaluation. I'm available. I've just been asked by that 5-star restaurant to develop a food cart. So I don't even know what a 5-star food cart looks like, but they're really, right? Because 5-star is meant to be about this kind of exclusivity. Not everyone's supposed to be able to afford it, right? But they're going to be putting this street corner to street corner. So I'm interested in that, but we'll be involved in a more consulting basis there. We're trying to segue out and to the next thing.
All right, great. Thanks a lot, guys.
Okay.